The Arizona sun sank low over the market at Dustmere, its orange light settling across wagons and cattle and rows of wooden stalls that smelled of dust, sweat, and hay. Elias Turner guided his horse through the crowd, with his young son Samuel riding at his side. Elias's broad shoulders were tight with the work of the season, his hands rough from fence posts and reins, but he kept his voice steady for the boy. They had come for hay, nothing more. Samuel, not yet 6, rode tall in the saddle, his pale hair catching the last fire of daylight. He asked again if they could see the ponies before heading home, and Elias promised they would, though his mind was already on the chores waiting at the ranch. The boy's chatter stopped all at once. His small fingers gripped his father's sleeve. Elias turned, following his son's wide eyes. At the far edge of the market, where shadows swallowed most men whole, stood a figure bound to a post. It was a woman, her wrists caught in iron cuffs, her ankles shackled, her body sagging as though each breath cost more than it gave. The dress she wore was torn and stained with dirt, her bare feet blackened with dust, her hair a curtain of tangled dark that hid her face. The noise of the market rolled on around her, but no one looked her way, no one cared if she lived or fell. Samuel's voice was small. "Daddy, is she dying?" His words cut deeper than the wind. Elias dismounted and crouched beside the boy, telling him gently not to stare, yet his own eyes lingered on her broken form. Traders passed by, some glancing with mild curiosity, others pretending she was not even there. Elias asked a man standing nearby why she was chained. The trader shrugged, chewing on a stem of grass. Her brother had lost everything in cards, he said, and she had been the debt that remained. No one wanted her. Not sick, not ruined, not half a corpse already. The man laughed at his own words, but Elias did not. His stomach twisted. Samuel tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, please, she's hurt." There was no judgment in the boy's voice, only pure compassion, the kind Elias had not felt in years. He looked into his son's clear eyes, saw hope and innocence staring back, and something in his chest cracked. He turned again to the trader. "How much?" The man blinked, surprised. $5, he said, more to mock than to bargain. Without another word, Elias reached into his coat, pulled out the coins, and placed them in the man's hand. The cuffs were undone, and the woman fell forward, her weight collapsing into Elias's arms. She was hot with fever, light as a bundle of rags. Samuel's face tightened with worry as he asked what her name was. The trader only shrugged. She had none worth remembering. Elias lifted her onto his horse, settling her carefully before climbing up behind. Samuel followed on his small pony, glancing back often. Together they left the market. A man, a boy, and a woman no one wanted, riding into the fading light of the year 1876. The ride home was quiet, except for the sound of hooves striking the hard ground and the soft rasp of the woman's uneven breaths. Elias kept one arm steady around her so she would not slide from the saddle. Her body felt weightless, as if the fever had already hollowed her out. Samuel rode close behind, his little pony prancing to keep pace, his eyes fixed on the woman as though his own will might keep her alive. The land stretched wide around them, endless dry hills touched by the pale glow of evening, and Elias found himself staring into the horizon longer than he should, asking questions he had no answers for. By the time they reached the ranch, the sky was deep purple, and the first stars had begun to show. He carried the woman down from the horse, her head falling against his shoulder, her hair smelling faintly of smoke and dust. Samuel trailed after him, clutching the reins of the pony with one hand and the hem of his father's coat with the other. The boy whispered, asking if she would be all right. Elias gave no reply. He did not make promises he was not sure he could keep. He carried her to the old storage room that leaned against the side of the barn. It was little more than a shed, but it had 4 walls, a roof, and a door that locked against the wind. He set her down on the cot he had kept there for ranch hands when storms rolled through, then stepped back to study her. In the lamplight, her face looked sharp with hunger, her lips dry and cracked. Her wrists were raw where the shackles had bitten deep. Elias poured water into a tin cup and set it on the stool beside her. He told himself it was enough. that she would drink when she woke, and that was the end of his duty. Samuel, though, climbed onto the cot and pulled the thin blanket over her, his small hands fussing like a mother's. Elias almost told him to stop, but the boy's face was too serious, too kind, and Elias held his tongue. The night passed with restless silence. Elias heard her stir once, a faint groan, then nothing more. At dawn he rose early, as always, fed the horses, checked the fences, and tried to push her from his mind. But when he returned to the barn, Samuel was already there, sitting by her side with a book open in his lap, reading in a halting, careful voice. The woman's eyes were closed, yet her lips moved slightly, as if she were whispering the words along with him. Elias paused in the doorway, caught by the sight, then forced himself away. He told himself again that this was no more than obligation. A man could not ride past a dying soul, not with his boy watching. He owed her food, shelter, and a chance to live, nothing else. Yet as he walked back into the pale light of morning, he knew that in saving her, he had unsettled something in his own heart that he could not quite name. The days that followed moved slowly, each one stretching under the wide sky as if time itself was waiting to see what would come of the stranger Elias had brought home. She woke in fits and starts, her fever breaking but leaving her weak. She spoke little, answering only when pressed, her voice hoarse and quiet. Samuel was the one who filled the silences, bringing her water, showing her his drawings, and reading aloud in his stumbling way. At first she only listened, her eyes distant, but soon Elias noticed her lips moving with the words soft and almost hidden, as if she were testing the sound of her own voice again. Elias told himself she would leave when her strength returned, yet each day she lingered, and each day the house seemed less empty. He found her mending a tear in Samuel's shirt one afternoon, her fingers moving with skill born of long practice. Another evening, he came in from the fields and saw her by the fire, with the boy curled at her feet, her voice steady as she read from an old primer he had not touched in years. She did these things without being asked, as if work was her only way of paying for the air she breathed. Still, she carried herself like a guest who had overstayed. Her eyes stayed lowered, her hands folded when not working, her body poised to step back should anyone come too close. Elias noticed the way she would retreat to the small room by the barn when company came near, as if she were afraid someone might remember the chains. It gnawed at him more than he wished to admit, this quiet reminder that she was not yet part of the life he had built. The town, of course, wasted no time with their whispers. When Elias rode in for supplies, he caught the looks, the sidelong remarks half hidden beneath breath. Some called her a charity case, others something crueler. He ignored them, but their words followed him back across the prairie like dust he could not shake. At night, he lay awake, wondering what it meant for his boy, for his name, to keep a woman once shackled in his home. Yet, when dawn came, and Samuel's laughter rang from the porch as she showed him how to stitch a torn saddlebag, those doubts seemed weaker than the sight before him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with fire, Elias found her sweeping the porch. She paused when he approached, her hand tightening on the broom, but she did not step aside. Their eyes met in the fading light. For a moment Elias saw not a stranger, not a burden, but a woman who moved with quiet grace, who carried sorrow and strength in equal measure. He gave her a small nod, nothing more, and stepped past into the house. Yet long after, he thought of that moment, of the silence that did not feel empty, but alive with something he had not felt in many years. The first time Elias brought her into town, the morning was sharp with wind and dust, the kind that worked its way into a man's teeth and eyes. He had meant only to pick up supplies, a sack of flour, a coil of rope, nails for the fence, nothing more. But Samuel insisted on coming, and the woman, still pale though stronger now, had followed them from the house without a word. She wore one of Elias's late wife's plain dresses, the hem too short for her long frame, the sleeves rolled to fit. She carried herself with quiet steadiness, her dark hair pinned back, though loose strands brushed her cheek in the breeze. Elias had not asked her to come, but neither had he sent her back. The town of Dustmere was small, yet its eyes were sharp. When Elias tied his horse at the hitching post outside the general store, he felt the stares already gathering. A man might grow used to silence on the land, but in town silence often meant judgment. Samuel tugged at his hand, pointing toward the jars of sweets in the window, his face bright with hope. Elias gave him a coin and told him to choose carefully. By the time the boy hurried inside, voices had begun to stir behind them. "That the one he bought at market?" a woman whispered near the doorway of the dress shop. "Chains and all." Another voice, lower and sharper, said she had heard the stranger was nothing but trouble. Some man's debt sold cheap. A laugh followed, quick and mean. Elias kept his back straight, his jaw tight, but each word struck him like grit in a wound. The woman did not flinch. She stood a step behind him, her gaze fixed on the sky. Her chin lifted just enough to show she had heard every sound, yet refused to bow to it. When the door of the general store swung open, she followed Elias inside without breaking stride. The bell above the door rang, and the store fell hushed for a breath too long. Even old Mr. Daly behind the counter hesitated before greeting Elias. Samuel returned with a paper twist of sweets clutched in his hands, his face flushed with victory. He grinned up at the woman and held one out. She smiled, the first true smile Elias had seen from her, faint but warm, and took it with a nod. The sight of it, so small and honest, tightened something deep in Elias's chest. When they left, the whispers trailed after them like dust in the wind. Elias mounted his horse, his face set hard against the glances that followed. Samuel climbed onto the pony, already chewing his sweet content in his small world. The woman rode behind Elias, her hands light on the saddle, her eyes fixed forward. She said nothing, but the silence between them was no longer hollow. It was a silence filled with defiance, with strength, and with the unspoken truth that though the town might scorn her, she was no longer alone. The day was warm and bright, the kind of afternoon when the air shimmered above the rocks and the creek ran low, whispering over stones polished smooth. Elias was near the back pasture mending a section of fence, his sleeves rolled, his hands steady with hammer and nail. Samuel darted in and out of the tall grass nearby, chasing butterflies with a stick in his hand as though it were a sword. The woman was not far either, bent low to gather herbs she had found along the edge of the creek, her dark hair slipping loose as she worked. It was the first time in many weeks that the land seemed peaceful, the kind of peace that makes a man pause and breathe deep, believing perhaps the worst of storms had passed. The peace broke in a heartbeat. Samuel's voice rang out sharp, not with laughter but with terror. Elias looked up, his hammer falling from his hand. The boy had stumbled near a patch of brush, and there, coiled and ready, was a rattlesnake, its body tense, its head lifted, the rattle buzzing like dry bone. The sound cut through the air, chilling and fierce. Samuel froze, his eyes wide, his small frame trembling. Before Elias could reach him, the woman moved. She threw herself forward, swift and without thought, her body between the snake and the child. Her hand closed around the serpent just as it struck, its fangs sinking deep into her forearm. She did not cry out, only clenched her jaw, her face white with pain, and flung the snake into the brush with all her strength. It vanished in a coil of dust and grass, but the wound was already swelling, angry and red. Elias scooped Samuel into one arm and caught the woman with the other as she staggered. He carried them both toward the house, his chest hammering, his mind racing with old knowledge of herbs and cures his mother had once taught him. Samuel sobbed against his shoulder, begging for her not to die, his tears soaking into Elias's shirt. The woman, pale and trembling, tried to stand on her own, but her knees gave way. He laid her on the cot in the storage room, his hands moving quick as he crushed herbs, bound the wound tight, and pressed cool cloths to her fevered skin. The night stretched long, the lamp burning low, shadows dancing on the walls. Elias whispered words he had not spoken in years, old prayers, half-forgotten songs, anything to hold her to the world. Samuel clung to her free hand, refusing to leave her side. Near dawn she stirred, her eyes wild and feverish, her voice breaking as she murmured, "Please, please do not chain me again." The words cut Elias deeper than any blade. He bent close, his hand covering hers, his voice steady though his chest ached. "No one will chain you, not ever again." She slipped back into restless sleep, but he did not move. When the first light touched the horizon, Elias was still there, watching, guarding, and for the first time in many years, afraid of losing more than he could bear. The days after the snake bite were slow and heavy, as though the house itself held its breath. The woman's arm remained wrapped in cloth, the skin angry and swollen, but each sunrise brought a little more color to her cheeks. Samuel refused to leave her side, bringing her water, whispering stories, placing his toy horse on the blanket near her hand. Elias moved between the fields and the house, his eyes drawn back to the small storage room more often than he cared to admit. He told himself he was only checking her wound, only making certain the fever stayed down, yet something in him was restless, as if he feared what might happen if he looked away for too long. It was on a cool morning, the air sharp with the scent of pine, that she stepped outside on her own again. She walked slowly, her arms still weak, but her steps carried a quiet determination. Elias watched her from the pasture as she moved to the barn, her figure slight against the rising light. Later, when he returned, he found her sweeping in the old storage shed where she had once lain half dead. Dust swirled in the beams of sun that slipped through the cracks. The scrape of her broom struck something solid, and she knelt, curious. A loose board gave way beneath her hand, and from beneath it she drew out a bundle wrapped in brittle cloth. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped it, revealing papers yellowed with time, their edges curling, the ink faded but still legible. There was a land deed, stamped and sealed, a map drawn by hand and letters tied with string. At the bottom lay a necklace of silver, tarnished but whole, with a small pendant engraved with letters that spelled out her name. She held it as though it might vanish if she let go, her breath catching in her throat. Memories came like floodwater, sharp and merciless. She saw fire licking at wooden walls, heard the crack of rifles, the screams of her mother, the way her brother Simon had pulled her into the hills while their home turned to ash. Their father had died the winter before, leaving them with little but the land, and when raiders stole it, nothing remained. Elias found her kneeling there, the necklace clutched in her hand, tears streaking her face. She looked up at him with eyes dark and fierce. Her voice shook as she spoke. "This land was once ours," she said. "My father's, my family's, before it was stolen." Elias's jaw tightened, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "You were digging behind my barn without a word," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. She rose slowly, clutching the pendant, her voice breaking. "You still do not trust me. You think I was born in chains, but I was not. I had a father who worked the land, a mother who sang in church. I was not always this." Elias's anger softened at the sight of her trembling hands, the fire in her eyes dimming to pain. He stepped closer, lifted the necklace, and fastened it gently around her neck. The pendant rested against her heart. His voice was low but steady. "You are not what happened to you. You are who you choose to be now, here, with us." Her breath came ragged, her eyes closed, and for the first time in years she let herself believe she might not be lost anymore. The morning sun rose pale and thin, spilling silver light across the ranch. The air carried the scent of dry earth and hay, and the sound of roosters echoed through the stillness. Eliza stood at the edge of the yard, her hands brushing over the small patch of ground near the porch. It was hard-packed and full of weeds, but to her it looked like a place that might yet hold promise. She thought of her mother's hands, always busy in the garden, coaxing life from stubborn soil, lavender blooming soft and fragrant, even in lean seasons. She whispered to herself that if she was to stay, she would need to put down roots, not in words, but in the earth itself. Elias watched her from the fence line, arms folded, his brow furrowed as if he did not know whether to stop her or to let her be. At last he walked over and set a spade against the ground beside her. His voice was low. "Pick something that will hold." something you believe in. She looked up at him, her eyes catching the morning light, and said quietly, "Lavender." He only nodded, then left her to it. The soil fought her, dry and unyielding, but she worked with patience, breaking it apart, mixing ash and compost, hauling water from the well. Samuel followed with his small trowel, eager and clumsy, scattering seeds in uneven lines. He asked if the plants would know they were loved, and Eliza brushed his curls from his forehead, whispering that they already did. Day after day, she bent her back to the earth, her hands dark with soil, her dress stained, but her spirit steadier than it had been in years. Slowly, thin stalks pushed through, frail at first but green and alive. She knelt beside them often, her fingers gentle, her prayers quiet but fierce. The townsfolk still whispered when she walked into Dustmere. Some women crossed the street, others turned their eyes away, and a few muttered words sharp as knives. Yet Eliza did not falter. She carried baskets of eggs, bundles of herbs, and soon small sprigs of lavender tied with ribbon. She left them on doorsteps, handed them to children, tucked them into Samuel's hands as he skipped along. He would grin and say, "From Miss E," with all the pride in the world. It was one such morning when Widow Thompson, known for her sharp tongue and sharper eyes, stepped out onto her porch, holding a bundle of lavender Eliza had left. She looked at the flowers, then at Eliza, and said briskly, "Come by Thursday. We need help for the church supper." Eliza blinked, certain she had misheard, but the widow had already turned inside. On Thursday the church kitchen smelled of cornbread and apples. Eliza worked with flour on her sleeves, laughter catching her by surprise when the widow muttered that her biscuits were passable. That night, walking home beneath a sky scattered with stars, Elias watched her from a step behind. She moved with the steady grace of someone who belonged, and the earth, once stubborn, seemed to be loving her back. The sky was a clean blue when the carriage rolled into the yard, its wheels polished, the harness gleaming with silver trim. Dust lifted behind it like a veil, and Elias, standing by the corral, felt his chest tighten before he even saw who stepped down. A woman in a pale cream dress, silk instead of cotton, her gloved hand resting lightly on the rail as if she had never known calluses or dirt. A feather dipped from the brim of her hat, and when she lifted her face, Elias knew her at once. Caroline Munro, the woman he had once thought he would marry, long before sorrow had carved lines into his life. She smiled as though no years had passed. "Elias," she said smoothly, "it has been far too long." Eliza stood on the porch, Samuel at her side, both watching in silence. She felt her stomach twist, though she kept her face calm. Caroline's voice carried into the house like music, rich and practiced, every gesture as polished as the shine on her boots. She stayed for supper, taking the seat beside Elias without hesitation, speaking of cities and grand halls, of friends who moved in circles of wealth and reputation. Samuel leaned close, listening wide-eyed as she told tales of ships and banquets, her laughter flowing like honey. Eliza moved quietly in and out, carrying dishes, pouring coffee, her hands steady, though her chest felt raw. Caroline turned once to thank her, the smile on her lips touched with sweetness yet sharp enough to sting. Elias said little, his face unreadable, but his eyes followed every move, torn between the past that shimmered before him and the present that had grown, steady and unspoken, in the walls of his home. In the days that followed, Caroline lingered. She spoke of investments, of breeding programs for fine horses, of expanding the ranch into something known beyond Dustmere. She placed plans before Elias with ease, the same way she once had when they were young and dreaming together. Each time her words fell, Eliza felt the air grow heavier, though she did not speak of it. The town noticed quickly. Whispers traveled faster than dust on the wind. They said Elias was choosing sense over pity at last, that Caroline was the match any man would want, that the dark-haired woman who had once been in chains would soon be sent packing. Eliza kept her head high when she walked to town, though each word cut like a thorn. Samuel, confused and quiet, clung to her hand more often. One evening, as she tucked him beneath his quilt, he whispered, "If Miss Caroline becomes Mama, "Do I still call you Mama Eliza?" She kissed his brow and told him softly he could call her whatever he wished, though when she left his room her eyes were wet. That night she stood in the garden, the lavender bending in the cool wind, and whispered to the dark that she could not compete with silk and polish, nor with the memory of who Elias had once loved. Still, when she turned back toward the light of the house, she did not run. She chose to stay, though her heart carried the weight of a storm she could not yet name. The wind had shifted by late afternoon, carrying with it a bite that warned of the coming cold. Eliza had been folding laundry by the hearth when she noticed Samuel growing quiet, his cheeks flushed, his small frame shivering even near the fire. She pressed her hand to his brow and felt the heat that burned beneath his skin. Fear gripped her chest. She had known fevers before, ones that stole children in the night, and she wasted no time. She called for Elias, who came in from the yard with worry already in his eyes. He lifted Samuel into his arms, the boy limp against his shoulder, and laid him gently on his bed. Eliza moved swiftly, gathering what she had: willow bark for tea, peppermint to cool the heat, cloths to soak in cold water. She sat at Samuel's side, dabbing his brow, whispering old songs that her mother once sang to her, words of rain and rest. The boy tossed and turned, murmuring through cracked lips, sometimes calling for his father, sometimes for her. Each sound pierced her, yet she stayed steady, her voice never faltering. Elias paced the room like a man hunted, his hands clenching and unclenching, his eyes fixed on his son with a desperation he tried to hide. Once he muttered that they should fetch the doctor from town, but Eliza shook her head. The fever was high, but Samuel still breathed steady enough. The ride was too far, the night too cold, and if the boy worsened before dawn, he would never survive the journey. Elias looked as though the weight of the world pressed on him, but at last he sat beside them, silent, watching as Eliza worked. The hours stretched long. The fire sank low, shadows creeping along the walls, the sound of Samuel's labored breaths filling the space. Eliza never left him. She pressed cloths to his forehead, lifted him to sip bitter tea, stroked his hair when he whimpered. She prayed under her breath, not daring to ask for mercy too loudly, for fear heaven would not listen. At one point near midnight she leaned back, exhaustion heavy in her bones. But when Samuel cried out, she leaned forward again, singing softly until his eyes closed. Elias had never seen such devotion. He watched her, her hair falling loose, her dress wrinkled, her face pale with fatigue, yet her hands never stilled. She seemed carved from iron and tenderness both. Her strength pulled from something deeper than flesh. He thought of Caroline with her silks and her talk of wealth, and he knew in that moment that all her promises could not warm a house the way Eliza's presence did. Near dawn, Samuel's breathing steadied. The fever had not broken, but it eased enough that his small body relaxed. Eliza slumped in the chair, Samuel's hand still held in hers, her head resting near his pillow. Elias reached across, covering both their hands with his own. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of truth. "You are the reason this house still has life." She did not stir, too weary to answer. Yet his words hung in the air as the first light crept through the window, a promise unspoken but real all the same. The fever broke with the coming of dawn, leaving Samuel weak but smiling faintly, his hand still wrapped in Eliza's, as though he feared she might vanish if he let go. She brushed the damp curls from his forehead, whispering promises of broth and sunlight, once he was strong enough to rise. Elias stood at the doorway, his shoulders bowed, as if he had been carrying the weight of 2 lives through the long night. Relief softened the hard lines of his face, yet behind it lingered something heavier, something he could no longer hold in silence. Caroline had stayed at the ranch through the storm of nights, offering polite concern, yet her presence hung like a shadow. She spoke again of investments and reputation, of the future Elias could claim if he chose wisely. Her words were smooth, her voice sweet, but they rang hollow in the wake of Samuel's illness. Elias listened, though his eyes kept straying to where Eliza sat by the boy's side, her dress wrinkled, Her eyes ringed with weariness, yet her face alight with a quiet strength. He knew then what he had tried so long to deny. That evening, when the house settled into calm, Elias found Eliza by the porch. She was gazing out across the lavender patch, the stalks swaying in the evening breeze, their scent soft in the cool air. She held herself as one prepared to leave, her bag packed near her feet, her shoulders squared against the ache in her chest. She spoke first, her voice steady, though it trembled beneath. "I will never be what she is," she said. "Maybe that is why I should go." Elias stepped closer, the boards creaking beneath his boots. For a long moment he said nothing, and she mistook his silence for agreement. She bent to lift the bag, but he reached out, his hand covering hers, stopping her. "You think I brought you here out of pity," he said quietly. "You think I kept you because Samuel needed you. That was true once, but it is not true now." She looked at him then, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat. He pulled a folded paper from his coat, the words written in his hand unsteady but certain. He pressed it into her palm. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes tracing each line. It was not long, only a few words, yet they carried the truth he had held back for too long. It was never Caroline. It was always you, the woman who came in chains and brought us back to life. Her hand trembled, tears rising though she fought them. She whispered that she did not belong in his world, that the town would never forget where she had come from. Elias shook his head, his voice rough. "Let them talk. I built this ranch for survival, but I built this life for you, for us. Samuel needs you, and so do I." Eliza's breath came unsteady, her heart pounding like hooves across the plain. She let the bag fall to the porch, the sound small but final. Elias reached for her hand, his fingers calloused, hers scarred. Yet when they closed together, it felt like a vow, older than words. In that quiet, beneath the lavender-scented dusk, she chose to stay, and he chose her back. Snow had not yet touched the Arizona ground, but winter showed itself in other ways. In the frost that settled on the barn roof at dawn, in the way the wind curled sharp beneath coats, in the silence of trees stripped bare. Inside the house, warmth filled every corner, the hearth glowing, the scent of cedar and cinnamon rising with the crackle of flame. Samuel sat at the table with his small journal, his tongue pressed between his teeth as he bent over the page. Eliza leaned close, guiding his letters with a steady hand. He read aloud what he had written, his voice proud. "I have two parents now." His words rang simple, yet to Eliza they sounded like the truest blessing she had ever heard. She smiled, touched his hair, and whispered that was all she ever hoped to be. The lavender patch outside lay quiet, its stalks trimmed and bundled, drying in baskets near the fire. Eliza had spent weeks preparing for the Christmas market, stitching ribbons, baking biscuits, carving small soaps into shapes of stars. The women of Dustmere, who once turned their eyes away, now came to her with questions, advice, and laughter. Widow Thompson herself had pressed Eliza into organizing the church supper, muttering that she had more sense than anyone else to keep a kitchen running. Eliza had laughed, surprised by the sound of her own joy, a sound she had not heard from herself since childhood. On one crisp afternoon, Elias brought her to the back pasture. He handed her a rifle, and she blinked at him, uncertain. He told her softly that once he had not wanted her to hold a gun because she was still running, but now he wanted her to stop being afraid. She lifted the weapon, her hands trembling, her heart racing. Elias stood close, his voice calm. "Line up the sights. Breathe steady. Trust it." She fired, and the tin can at the top of the post tumbled to the dirt. She laughed, clear and free, the sound rolling across the land like new spring water. Elias smiled, pride in his eyes, and told her it was time she felt like part of the land itself. Christmas Eve came with pale light and quiet air. They ate together at the long table, Elias, Eliza, and Samuel. No guests, no ceremony, only warmth and belonging. After the meal, Samuel hurried away and returned with a small box wrapped in a red scarf. He placed it in Eliza's hands, his eyes shining. She opened it carefully, finding inside the silver necklace from her father's cedar box. Beside it hung a wooden heart charm, carved clumsily by Samuel, etched with the single word, Mama. Eliza's breath caught, her fingers closing around both charms, then around the boy himself. "You are my real mama now," Samuel said, "not just in my head." She looked up and found Elias watching her, his eyes soft, his silence stronger than any vow. In that moment, the house was no longer a place for survival, but a home built from choice, from love, from every step that had brought them here. She had come in chains, but she stayed by her own will, no longer nameless, no longer lost. The future stretched before them wide and open as the sky, carrying the promise of seasons yet to come. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Western Love Legends. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Every story we tell carries the dust of the past and the hope of tomorrow, and I would love to have you ride along with us. And remember, even out here in the Wild West, biscuits still burn if you forget to take them out of the oven.